In October 1984, Dale Merriman had the best corn crop of his life, 1,200 acres across 3 counties in central Illinois. Average yield of 180 bushels per acre, forward contracted at $3, $40 a bushel, locked in back in February when prices were strong and the mood on every farm was electric. By any accountant's math, Dale had cleared $240,000 in net profit that year. His lender was thrilled. His neighbors were quietly jealous. His wife was already talking about a new roof on the farmhouse. And on the 3rd Friday of October, he couldn't cut payroll. 4 farmhands. Men who had worked that harvest for 12 straight days. Men who had driven combines through mud, fixed augers at midnight, and hauled grain until their backs gave out. Dale owed them a combined $11,400. He had $2,800 in his operating account. Would you call that success? Most people hear this story and assume something went wrong. A bad deal, a crooked banker, a hidden debt. But none of that was true. Dale Merriman wasn't a victim of fraud or bad luck. He was a victim of a gap, a timing gap between when profit is earned and when cash actually arrives. And that gap nearly destroyed everything he'd built. Let me take you back to early 1983, because this story doesn't start at harvest. It starts with a land lease and a decision that felt bulletproof at the time. Dale had been farming 480 acres his family rented and owned outright. Modest operation, reliable. He ran it lean, 2 hired men during planting and harvest, everything else himself. But in the spring of 1983, 2 things happened at once. Corn prices were rising, and a neighboring farmer named Harold Bates decided he was done. Harold was 71 years old and had been farming 720 acres for 40 years. Bad knees, no sons who wanted the work, a wife who'd been asking him to retire since 1979. Harold didn't want to sell the land. It had been in his family since the 1920s, but he was willing to lease it. Long-term, 5-year agreement, cash rent, $160 per acre per year. Dale did the math. 720 acres at $160 was $115,200 in annual rent. Steep, but with corn pushing toward $3.50 and yield potential on that ground, averaging close to 170 bushels, the margins looked solid. On paper, the deal made sense. His father-in-law told him he was overreaching. His operating lender, a farm credit officer named Bill Randolph, told him the loan would be approved but urged caution. Dale's own gut said move fast before someone else grabbed it. He signed the lease in April 1983. That's when the pressure started, though Dale couldn't see it yet. The expanded operation now covered 1,900 acres. Total input costs for the 1984 crop year, once seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, and labor were fully loaded, came to $312 per acre. Multiply that across 1,200 acres and you get $374,400 in production costs before Dale netted a single dollar. Where did that money come from? An operating line of credit. Standard practice in Midwest grain farming. Bill Randolph approved $400,000 at the Farm Credit Office. Interest rate in early 1984, 5%. On a line that size, every month it sat drawn down was costing Dale roughly $4,500 in interest charges. And that line started getting used in February. Seed orders, fertilizer contracts, early chemical purchases. By May, Dale had drawn nearly $280,000. The clock was running. The operating loan was only one pressure point. The forward contract was another. And this one had teeth Dale didn't fully feel until it was too late. Back in February, Dale had contracted 60% of his expected production, roughly 130,000 bushels, at $3.40. Corn was trading strong, the ag press was optimistic, and locking in price felt like exactly the kind of disciplined move a serious farmer made. His lender liked it. His accountant liked it. On paper, it reduced price risk. But here's what forward contracting does that nobody talks about enough. It locks your revenue to a delivery date. Dale's contract called for delivery in October and November, with payment terms standard to the elevator. Net 30 days after delivery completion. Think about what that means in practice. Dale finishes harvest in late October. He delivers grain to the elevator through the first week of November. The elevator confirms receipt. Payment is issued 30 days after final delivery. That puts the bulk of his contracted revenue arriving in December. After input costs have been billed, after interest has been accruing for 10 months, and after 4 men have been waiting to get paid since the second week of October. That's the gap. Not a scandal, not a mistake, just timing. But the gap was wider than Dale expected, and here's why. The elevator where Dale delivered his grain was Midstate Cooperative out of Bloomington. Good operation, well run, no complaints in ordinary years. But 1984 was not an ordinary year. The corn harvest across central Illinois was enormous. Bin space was tight across the entire region. Midstate's payment processing, always a little slow in heavy harvest years, backed up by 3 weeks. Dale had expected payment on December 10th. The check didn't arrive until January 3rd, 3 weeks. That doesn't sound like the end of the world, but Dale's operating loan had called for a year-end paydown of at least $200,000 by December 31st. Farm Credit's terms were clear: partial repayment before the new year, or the loan was in technical default. 3 weeks late on the elevator check meant Dale hit December 31st with only $80,000 available to pay down. He was $120,000 short of the required reduction. That's when Bill Randolph called. Not a threatening call. Bill was a reasonable man who had been in agricultural lending for 22 years and had seen this pattern more times than he could count. But reasonable or not, the call had a message underneath it. The bank needed to see a restructuring plan. The operating line for 1985 would not be automatically renewed at the same amount. Dale would need to demonstrate reduced exposure. Is profit real if you can't make payroll? Is a record year actually a record year if you finish it in technical default on your operating loan? Dale didn't have clean answers to those questions. But he was about to get a financial education that most farmers only get the hard way. The farmhands had been patient. Dale had been straight with them, told them the check was delayed, told them he'd make it right, gave each of them a partial payment of $500 from personal savings to cover immediate needs. They trusted him. That trust was worth something, but it wasn't a long-term solution. Dale's wife, Carol, sat at the kitchen table with him the last week of November and laid everything out in columns. Revenue expected, $408,000, the forward contracted bushels plus the spot sale bushels still sitting in rented bin space. Expenses paid, $312 per acre times 1,200 acres, so $374,400. Net profit, $240,000 on paper. Cash on hand, $12,800 in the operating account. Cash owed immediately, $11,400 in farmhand wages, $31,200 in remaining equipment lease payments, $4,500 in interest charges already posted, and $200,000 in the operating loan paydown. Carol circled the cash on hand number. "Dale," she said, "the farm made $240,000 this year, and we have $2,800. He couldn't argue with the math. He also couldn't explain it to her in a way that felt like anything other than failure. But here's the thing most people miss about this moment. Dale wasn't failing. He was experiencing the difference between profit and liquidity, between what the farm earned and what was actually available to spend. Those are two different numbers, and in agriculture they can diverge by months. Profit is an accounting event. Cash flow is a survival event. The farm's income statement looked excellent. The bank account told a different story. The core problem was working capital, the buffer between short-term assets and short-term obligations. Before expansion, Dale's operation carried enough slack that a delayed elevator payment was an inconvenience. After expansion, the same delay was a crisis. He had scaled his production without scaling his cash reserves. The operating loan covered input costs, but it assumed timely payment receipt. When the timeline slipped, there was no cushion. Farmers who run tight operations know this intimately. Every bushel you grow, every acre you rent, every dollar you borrow on an operating line is a commitment made months before revenue arrives. The bigger the operation, the longer the float. And the longer the float, the more vulnerable you are to any disruption in the payment chain. An elevator delay, a contract dispute, a weather event that pushes harvest back 2 weeks. Dale had expanded his float without understanding it. The restructuring conversation with Bill Randolph happened in the second week of January, after the elevator check finally cleared and Dale had paid his farmhands in full with cash left over. The relief of that moment lasted about 6 hours, until Bill's call came in. The terms were not punishing, but they were firm. The operating line for 1985 would be capped at $300,000, a reduction of $100,000 from the prior year. Dale would need to reduce his planted acres accordingly. The Farm Credit Office also strongly recommended he consider whether the Harold Bates lease was sustainable at its current scale, not a directive, a recommendation. The kind of recommendation a lender makes when the underlying message is, "We will not be financing this level of exposure again." Dale drove out to the Bates property that February and walked the fields in the snow. 720 acres. Good ground. He'd put 2 good crops on it, a decent 1983 and a record 1984. And now he was going to have to give most of it back. He called Harold and had a conversation he described later as one of the hardest of his farming life. Not because Harold was angry, he wasn't. Harold had seen farm operations rise and fall for 50 years and had nothing but respect for Dale's work. The hard part was what it meant. Dale had built his identity around that expansion. 1,200 acres, the biggest operation he'd ever run. And now he was contracting back to 640 acres, his original ground plus 1 parcel of the Bates lease he kept at a renegotiated rate. The downsizing felt like defeat in March of 1985. It didn't feel that way by 1986, because here is the twist that Dale himself didn't see coming, the one that changes the moral of the entire story. In 1985, corn prices fell, and in 1986, they collapsed. The same price environment that had made Dale's 1984 forward contracts look smart turned dangerous for farmers carrying large operating loans and rented acres. Corn dropped below $2 per bushel in some Illinois markets. Farmers who had expanded aggressively, who had locked in high cash rents on large acreages and were now trying to service operating loans on $1.80 corn, were in foreclosure territory. Dale, with 640 acres, a smaller operating line, and a hard lesson in cash flow discipline still fresh in his mind, made it through. He ran lean. He forward contracted earlier and at higher proportions. He built a small cash reserve, 3 months of operating expenses, sitting in a separate account, untouched unless he had a genuine emergency. He never had $240,000 on paper again in those years, but he made payroll every single harvest. And when the farm credit crisis of the mid-1980s hit its worst point, Dale Merriman was not on the list of farmers losing their operations. The forced contraction had saved him from a larger collapse. Think about that carefully. The liquidity crisis of 1984, the crisis that humiliated him, that made him explain to 4 hard-working men why their check was late, that put him in technical default on his operating loan. That same crisis forced him to reduce his exposure before the price collapse hit. If he had solved the cash flow problem in 1984 without changing his scale, if he'd simply borrowed more to bridge the gap and kept farming 200 acres, he would have been exactly the kind of operation that didn't survive 1986. The near disaster of 1984 was also the early warning system that kept him farming. Dale eventually told this story to his son, who went into farming in the early 1990s. He walked him through every number. The $374,400 in input costs, the 13.5% operating interest rate, the 30-day payment terms at the elevator, the 3-week delay that turned a December paydown into a January scramble. He wasn't dramatic about it. He laid the numbers on the table the same way Carol had in November of 1984. A profit statement tells you what you earned, he told his son. A cash flow statement tells you whether you can stay in business. You need both. But if you only look at one, look at the cash flow. You can survive a bad year on the income statement. You cannot survive a month when you can't make your obligations. His son wrote it down, posted it on the wall of the farm office. Profit is accounting. Cash flow is survival. There's no villain in this story. Bill Randolph at Farm Credit was doing his job responsibly, and in hindsight, doing Dale a favor by forcing the restructuring. Harold Bates was a decent man who held no grudges and leased Dale back one parcel at a fair rate. Mid-State Cooperative's payment delay wasn't intentional. It was an operational backlog in a record harvest year. The farmhands were paid in full. Nobody went broke. Nobody lost land. Nobody filed for anything. What happened was simpler and harder to dramatize than any of those outcomes. A good farmer, a hard-working, intelligent, genuinely skilled farmer, expanded his operation without expanding his understanding of the financial mechanics underneath it. He confused a strong income statement with a healthy operation. He scaled acreage without scaling cash reserves. He treated a forward contract as pure protection without accounting for how it interacted with payment timing and operating loan terms. And for about 90 days in late 1984 and early 1985, that misunderstanding put everything at risk. The lesson isn't that expansion is bad, or that forward contracting is dangerous, or that operating loans are a trap. Dale used all three of those tools for the rest of his farming career. The lesson is that each one of those tools changes your cash flow profile, the timing and certainty with which money moves through your operation. And if you don't understand that profile, if you're making decisions based only on what the income statement says, you're flying without instruments. $240,000 in profit in 1984. Couldn't make payroll at harvest. Both of those things were true at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's agriculture. And that distinction between what you earned and what you can spend is the one that separates farmers who survive the hard years from farmers who don't. If this story shifted how you think about farm finance, profit, and the difference between income and cash, drop a comment below. Tell me whether you'd seen this kind of situation in your own operation or your family's history. Because this story was more common than anyone talked about in 1984, and the fundamentals haven't changed. Then share this with someone who's expanding their operation right now, someone who's looking at projected income and feeling confident. Because confidence built on a profit statement alone is the most dangerous kind there is. And subscribe because the next story is about a farmer who understood cash flow perfectly and still nearly lost everything for a completely different reason. That one's coming soon.